It's time for Caddie Woodlawn, Chapter 3, Pigeons in the Sky. The next day was Sunday, and of course, the schoolhouse was opened and everyone went to church. Mrs. Woodlawn brought a bunch of her autumn flowers to decorate the desk. She had driven over early with her husband and Mr. Tanner to open and air the schoolhouse, which had been closed since summer. The children followed on foot. They had a mile to go, across a field and along a dusty road. They rubbed their feet through the tall grass by the schoolhouse gate to take the dust off their Sunday shoes. People from all the surrounding farms and homesteads had come to hear the circuit rider speak. Even Sam Hankinson was there, sitting in the back seat with his 3 little children about his knees. But his Indian wife stayed outside. Caddie peeped at them curiously through her fingers when Mr. Tanner's prayer grew very long. How would it be to have an Indian for a mother, she wondered. Then she looked at Mrs. Woodlawn, so fine in her full black silk, with that cameo brooch and earrings, and the small black hat, and she was glad that this was mother. And yet, she thought, she would not be ashamed of an Indian mother, as Sam Hankinson seemed to be ashamed of his Indian wife. The next day the circuit rider rode away on his horse. Father set his clock upon the shelf to be mended later, and life went on again as usual. But now the children began to talk about when Uncle Edmund would come. For Uncle Edmund always came with the pigeons in the fall. He made his annual visit when the shooting was at its best, for he was an eager, if not a very skillful, sportsman. Mrs. Woodlawn sighed. "No one can say that I am not a devoted sister," she said, "but the prospect of a visit from Edmund always fills me with alarm. My house is turned upside down. My children behave like wild things. There is nothing but noise and confusion." "But Ma!" cried Tom. "Don't ma me, my child," said Mrs. Woodlawn calmly. "But Mother," persisted Tom, defending his hero, "Uncle Edmund knows the most tricks." "And jokes," cried Caddie. "Remember when he put the hairbrush in Caddie's bed?" shouted Warren. "And the time he put a frog in a covered dish on the supper table, and when Mrs. Conroy lifted the cover—" "That is enough, Tom," said his mother. "We remember Uncle Edmund's tricks very well, and I've no doubt we'll soon see more of them." But she looked forward to her younger brother's coming just the same. And when the pigeons came and there was no Uncle Edmund, everyone felt surprised and concerned. One night when they went to bed, the sky was clear and the woods were still. But when they awoke in the crisp autumn morning, the air was full of the noise of wings, and flocks of birds flew like clouds across the sun. The passenger pigeons were on their way south. They filled the trees in the woods. They came down in the fields and gardens, feeding on whatever seeds and grains they could find. The last birds kept flying over those which were feeding in front in order to come at new ground, so that the flock seemed to roll along like a great moving cloud. "The pigeons have come!" shouted the little Woodlawns. "The pigeons have come!" Even Baby Joe waved his arms and shouted. Tom and Warren armed themselves with sticks and went out with the hired men. But for once, Caddie stayed indoors. She liked hunting as well as the boys, but this was too easy. This was not hunting. It was a kind of wholesale slaughter. She knew that the Indians and the white men, too, caught the birds in nets and sent them by thousands to the markets. She knew that wherever the beautiful gray birds went, they were harassed and driven away or killed. Something of sadness filled her young heart, as if she knew that they were a doomed race. The pigeons, like the Indians, were fighting a losing battle with the white man. But John Woodlawn was not a glutton as some of his neighbors were. He said to Tom and the hired men, "There is not much grain left in the fields now. Drive the birds off and keep them from doing harm as well as you can. But don't kill more than we can eat. There is moderation in all things." And so that night there was pigeon pie for supper. But on the Woodlawn farm, no more birds were killed than could be eaten. After supper, Robert Ireton, strumming his banjo out by the barn, sang the song that everybody had on his lips at this time of the year. When I can shoot my rifle clear at pigeons in the sky, I'll bid farewell to pork and beans and live on pigeon pie. The three children, huddled around him on the chilly ground, hummed or sang with him, and all about them in the darkness was the rustle and stir of wings. A few days later, the passenger pigeons had disappeared as suddenly as they had come. They had taken up their perilous journey toward the south. It was as if they had never passed by, except that the woods were stripped of seeds and acorns and dried berries, and some folks still had cold pigeon pie in their kitchens, or dead birds on their truck heaps. Then, after the pigeons were all gone, came a letter from Uncle Edmund announcing his arrival on the next steamer. The little steamer, as everyone called it, came up the Menominee River once a week as far as Dunville. Its arrival was a great event, for all the letters from the East, all the news from the great world, most of the visitors and strangers and supplies came up the river on the little steamer. The Woodlawn children begged to be allowed to go and meet Uncle Edmund. "Certainly we can't take all of you," said Mrs. Woodlawn calmly. "I shall let Clara and Tom go, because they are the eldest." Tom looked at Caddie and Warren with a superior smile. "Too bad you little children have to stay at home," he said, "but we can't take all of you." "All right for you, Tom," said Caddie, talking like that. She and Warren withdrew. They crossed the barnyard and climbed to the haymow. Nero went with them to the bottom of the ladder. He was quick to sense trouble of any sort, and his tail wagged in mournful sympathy. Caddie and Warren buried themselves in the hay and talked things over. When father or mother made a decision, the Woodlawn children accepted it as final. There was very little teasing for favors in a large pioneer family. But not to meet Uncle Edmund was unthinkable. "It's just because they haven't room for us in the wagon," said Caddie at last. "But if we walked—" "Sure," said Warren, his face brightening. "And let's not tell them we're walking either. Let's save it for a surprise. Or maybe we could take one of the horses," suggested Caddie. "Pete's the fastest," said Warren. "Better take Betsy. Pete always runs for the low shed behind the barn and scrapes us off." "Sure," said Warren. "We'll take Betsy." When the time came to meet the steamer, Clara and Tom, in their Sunday clothes, climbed into the wagon behind Mr. and Mrs. Woodlawn. Tom was a little sorry for Caddie and Warren, but he couldn't resist a smirk of satisfaction. Only, strangely enough, Caddie and Warren did not seem as depressed over being left behind as they should have been. They stood beside the wagon, grinning like two Cheshire cats. Hetty and little Minnie stood with them, looking properly wistful. The moment the wagon started, Caddie and Warren made a beeline for the barn to get old Betsy and ride across the fields and through the woods. Hetty saw them go, and instant realization of what they were going to do flashed across her mind. Here was something important to tell. "Father! Mother!" she shouted, running down the lane behind the wagon. "Stop! Stop! Father! Mother!" But her voice was lost in the rattle of wheels, and in a cloud of dust, the wagon disappeared. Across the field, in the other direction, flew Betsy, the black mare, with only a rope and halter, and Caddie and Warren clinging like monkeys to her bare back. Here's the picture. Caddie and Warren on the back of Betsy. Super fun. Dunville consisted of the schoolhouse, which the children attended in winter and summer, a few log cabins, a store, and 2 taverns, one on either side of the river where the little steamer docked and turned around. As the little steamer came into sight, Mr. and Mrs. Woodlawn, Clara and Tom, were standing on the dock ready with handkerchiefs to wave at sight of Uncle Edmund. Yes, Uncle Edmund was there. His round face was creased with smiles. His round eyes, behind his spectacles, twinkled with delight. As soon as his voice could be heard over the sound of churning water, he shouted, "Hello there! Hello, Harriet and John! Hello, Tom and Clara! Hey there, Caddie and Warren! Why don't you come on down?" Caddie and Warren? The Woodlawns on the dock turned sharply around. There they were, Caddie and Warren, sitting on the bank above, their bare legs dangling, their red heads shining. They grinned sheepishly. "Well, of all things!" cried Mrs. Woodlawn, her clear brow darkening ominously. She was going to say a great deal more, but suddenly the little steamer docked with a bump, and she was obliged to catch her husband's arm to keep her balance. Then they were all in Uncle Edmund's large, enthusiastic embrace, even Caddie and Warren. Uncle Edmund was so delighted that they had all come to meet him that nobody could bear to tell him it had not been planned that way. As they were walking up the path from the dock, Uncle Edmund began to fumble in his pocket. "Wait," he said, "I've got a present here for Caddie." Caddie stopped in her tracks, speechless with joy. The others crowded around them. Out of his pocket, Uncle Edmund took a fat little book. Caddie had never felt much need of books, but any sort of present was a rare delight. She took the little book from Uncle Edmund's hand and opened the cover. Whiz! Something long and green flew out at her and fell into the path. Uncle Edmund shouted with laughter, and Caddie laughed too, a little ruefully. She picked up the long green thing which lay in the path. "That's no snake," she said. "It's got a clock spring inside it." "Say, Uncle Edmund," cried Tom, "you'd ought to know you can't fool Caddie on snakes or clock springs. Try that on Hetty."